Hey everyone. Yeah, thanks for coming today. We've got quite a few people in person, and we've also got a lot of people joining online, so it's great seeing all of you here today. I'm Kevin, co-founder and CTO of Riley, and yeah, so Riley is a platform for helping product teams develop better strategies by analyzing disparate sources of data automatically for you. However, for building a successful product, it's not just data that's disparate, though. It's also skills, experiences, and a lot of other things that we need to bring together in order to successfully execute. That's why I'm glad that we're all here today to join together and learn from members of our own community in order to actually share all of the information that's necessary for us to move forward successfully. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce our panelists. We have 4 panelists here. The first one is Christelle Ngnoumen. Christelle is the AVP of Behavioral Science Research at Voya Financial. She is a behavioral researcher and designer with over 10 years of experience in analyzing human decision-making and behavior. Prior to Voya Financial, Christelle was the principal behavioral and experience designer at Headspace. Our next panelist is, I just realized the panelists are not actually in order on my card and the screen, so please excuse me for that. Our next panelist is Yoni DeBeule, who is first on the screen. Yoni is the head of digital product and user experience at Google Fiber. Prior to Google, Yoni led design and product organizations at 5stars and Yelp. At 5stars, he launched product experiences that contributed to a successful $317 million acquisition by SumUp. Our next one, which is now in order, is Auzita Irani. Auzita is a research manager at Airbnb, where she currently leads the Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technologies UXR team. Prior to Airbnb, she was a research manager at Meta. And our final panelist is Christine Kushner. Christine was most recently part of strategy and corporate ventures at VMware. Prior to that, she spent 15 years as a product management leader at Wells Fargo, where she launched first-to-market technologies for digital wallets, credit cards, and enterprise services, and authored over 40 patents. And finally, your moderator for today's panel is Claudia Natasha. I'm sure many of you already know her and love her, my wonderful co-founder and the CEO of Riley. With that, I hand this off to Claudia.
Thank you, Kevin. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see you today, and to everyone who's joining online also, hello. So I wanted to start by asking a couple of questions, but before that, I want to make sure that everyone who is joining online gets an opportunity to ask questions as well. So I know that I reached out to everyone today prior to the event to ask you all to submit questions, and I got all of those questions. And we'll take audience questions from today. But if you're online, Lillian is there to help moderate the live stream. So if any of the speakers bring up anything that's particularly interesting, which I know they will, feel free to discuss it on the chat, or you can also ask any questions, and Lillian will choose 2 or 3 to ask at the end. All right, let's get started. Are you all ready? I'm so excited because I have it's always more fun to moderate. All right, let's get started. So really curious, the way we're gonna structure these questions is I'll start with a group of questions about using data, and then we'll talk about making decisions with data, but we'll start with using data first. And the first question is, what are the different data sources that you use when trying to make strategies or trying to craft strategies?
I have a mic, so.
All right. Auzita's starting.
I'm happy to start. I would say there's a couple different kinds of data sources that I personally look at and like to use. The first category is just behavioral. So we're looking at what are the actions that people are taking, what are the different kinds of interactions they're making as they go through a funnel, for example. And then there's also the other category, which is attitudinal, right? And so we want to understand how do people feel about something? How are they interacting with it? What is their mental model as they go through an experience? And so there's different kinds of ways that you would get this data, but those are the 2 major categories of things that I'm constantly looking at and using.
I guess I have a mic as well, so I'll go next. Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. So, as a behavioral scientist and behavioral researcher, and a lot of the work that, myself, my teams have done in the past, we're usually working on behavior change products. So for example, in the L&D space, trying to figure out how to make people become kind of more effective leaders, or in the digital health space, right, building tools that can help people with achieving better health and wellness, like decreasing their stress or improving their sleep. Or in the financial space, right, people want to save, so how to help them kind of get from that point A to point B. And the reason I bring this up is because, in terms of the data sources, the approach tends to be one of recognizing people are trying to get from like a point A to point B, but then there are going to be barriers that get in the way, or things that make it harder for them to sort of progress towards those behavioral goals or outcomes. And so not only do we want to look at the behavioral data in terms of kind of how are they engaging, say, with the digital tool and the interactions, we really want to contextualize that and look at those factors that influence behavior, so that when it comes to making them kind of move forward, we can understand what are the levers to pull. So definitely agree with you. Similarly, like behavioral data, like more interaction type based data, but then also leveraging things like surveys, questionnaires, interviews, to also understand, what are those cognitive or motivational or, environmental kind of factors that maybe are preventing them from moving forward. And then one other piece too that I'll emphasize that, I use often, it sometimes gets neglected, is secondary research. So, there's a work that like we'll do and we'll collect, but then recognizing that there are also these additional secondary resources, right? Other research that other people have done that we can actually use as a lens through which to understand, these behaviors or the problems. So think like third-party competitor insights, public databases, or even just, the body of evidence-based research that academics often work on. So those are a few.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add anything?
I'll have a crack at this one, and I'll speak to my role when I was in product strategy and product management. I'll second what you said about secondary research. You get these really insightful research reports, and so those are things that one can validate and see if it's true for one's own customers. And I think in the product seat, you want all the different kinds of data that you can possibly get. I think that we're a little bit like modelers, or super greedy about data. What data do you want? I want all of the data. So the usage data, the attitudinal data, the survey data, the interview data. And I think that one thing that's really interesting and important is to collect what the wisdom is from the business side and compare it to the hard data. And sometimes they don't match, which is really interesting. And then you have to figure out what is the reason for that. And there's things to be learned from that as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. This actually transitions really well to the second question. So what's really fascinating about all of the different types of data sources, whether it's primary or whether it's secondary, which Christelle brought up earlier, is with all of these data sources, it's often really important to find a way to combine them into meaningful insights. So to do something that I'm sure everyone here has heard the term data triangulation, combining all of these data sources together to produce meaningful insights. From your experience, how have you done data triangulation, and how have you seen data triangulation work for strategies in the past? Maybe we can start with Yoni for this one.
Sure, I'll take a crack. It reminds me of one example we did at 5 Stars, which was, for those of you who don't know the product, it's a small business loyalty program. So it's like a digital punch card replacement. And what we were struggling with at the time is trying to increase our engagement for the program overall, but especially the mobile app. We had a mobile app, no one was using it. How do we boost that? And so we started looking at product analytics, like user behavior. And what we found was that a lot of our users had one membership at one business, very loyal to that business. But then we had a lot of other users who actually had programs running with multiple businesses. And we saw that a lot of them were in close proximity to each other. And so that was a behavior we had not really encouraged. And so that got us kind of curious to investigate that deeper. What other sources can we correlate to this? And so we looked at previous research and did another a research study, interviewing some of our users to kind of drill into that more. And what we found was really interesting. We found that a lot of our users were not just loyal to one business that on our platform, but they were just kind of like small business shoppers. And so that was an insight that we hadn't really discovered before. And then we also found out that they are very loyal to their kind of behavior. Like coffee drinkers go to multiple coffee shops. Boba drinkers go to other boba places. And so that actually got us the idea to build this product alpha that we would roll out. That was a MVP in store where a customer could come in a store, and at the end we would promote other deals that were nearby. This product, from an analytics point of view, was performing very well, but we also did an ethnography that we tied to it, and that ethnography showed that these users really loved that. And so kind of, that narrative, those three data sources just together just gave us incredible confidence. And we just went all in with our mobile app. We made the entire mobile app all about just finding these local deals, essentially throughout almost everything else. And that worked beautifully. Like it was a big win for our users, it was a big win for our merchants, it was a big win for the business. It was just very successful to kind of like just tie those things together. And sort of, I don't know, to me it always felt when we do this as like a little bit of a treasure hunt. We're trying to find one clue and trying to find another piece of data that correlates. I think it was brought up before, like sometimes data doesn't align, but when it does align and you can actually kind of like tie these things together, it's really fun.
Yeah, and I think Yoni brings up a great point, which is that when you triangulate data or work with data, so often you don't necessarily, you shouldn't come in with the mindset of knowing what to expect, right? Like usually when you try to combine quant data and qual data, and I'm curious how you've all experienced this, do you discover anything new? Because when you run quant analysis, like you're trying to run a regression model to predict something, you tend to have hypotheses, but very so often from my own experience, I find that actually the hypotheses are completely off base, and then I end up discovering something new. So really curious what your experiences are with that.
I can share a story really quickly. One of the projects that I worked on was we did a lot of interviews and really like one-to-one user research with people that were interacting in Facebook groups. And we found a very particular behavior that some people were engaging with that was really fascinating, completely different than what we expected. And we're like, wait, this is really cool, and maybe there's a huge opportunity here. And so the next step that we took was essentially working with our quant researcher to understand, can we do a large-scale survey to see how many people are engaging in this behavior and what are the markers of the people that engage in that behavior. And so after we did the survey, we got some really interesting findings that we basically combined the qualitative insights that we had with the quant survey results, and then took that to the data science team and essentially helped them figure out what are those things that we're looking for in order to be able to size this opportunity or to size like the behavior that we are seeing in these different groups. And it was so interesting because based on the qualitative research as well as the survey, you would think that there's so many people, engaging in this one particular weird behavior, but it turns out that it's actually a very small subset of people that just do a vast majority of the actions in those different groups. And so it was a really, really small group, but they were incredibly active and they did, just a whole bunch of things that we didn't expect. And so I think this was a really good example for me in terms of how do we use different, data sources, how do we collaborate with other functions? So not just, qualitative and quantitative research, but also with data science and PM to really understand, what are we trying to look for and how do we validate or invalidate that this is a behavior or an opportunity that we care about.
All right. I think Auzita's answer actually brings us to like a nice transition to the next question. So you brought up that collaborating very closely with other functions are really important. And I think a question that I often receive from the community is, well, collaborating with other functions is important, but there's often disagreements between different functions on where to best engage with data teams and research teams. Is it at the beginning of the product lifecycle? Is it at the middle? Lots of researchers say, I want to be involved throughout, right? Because sometimes at the end, when you ship the product and there's something missing, someone gets blamed. So from your experience, what advice would you give to these product organizations? When is it best to engage with research and data teams? Perhaps from the perspective of PMs, from you, Christine, and also from the researchers and from the designers.
I'm happy to have a crack at this one because I feel fairly passionate about it. From from the PM seat, but I actually think from all seats, if you can find all of your stakeholders before you need them so that they know you and you know them, and bring them in on the ground floor, I think things always go better. And these stakeholders may not agree on approaches, but they like to be brought in. And if they don't need to be involved in the beginning, they'll tell you, thank you for letting me know. I'm excited about this project. Thank you for telling me about it. And then where I need to do things is going to be, at this part. So come back to me.
I love that point around, bringing people into the process as well, so they feel kind of both informed but also involved. And regarding the question of sort of where might be the best place for like research and insights, throughout the product development process, you may call me greedy, but I am of the sort of philosophy that actually research and insights needs to be integrated across all stages, right? That's what makes the process a data-driven one. So we're not, working on our hunches or intuition. The value of research and insights, towards the discovery phase, right, is to give us confidence that we are sort of looking at the right problem or going to tackle the right question. The value of research and insights during ideation, right, is so that we can have confidence that maybe the levers that we're pulling when we're thinking about designing a solution or an intervention or a feature, again, is sort of relevant to that problem or that behavior we want to drive. And then the value of research and insights, when we're evaluating, I think that one's a bit more clear, but it needs to be said, it's also in having confidence that those solutions, those features that we're introducing are actually effective, right, or have impact. So I believe it's across the board.
I'll just add to what Christine was saying. And I think in addition to having those good, strong relationships with your stakeholders ahead of time, I think it's also really important to know what they care about. Like, what are their goals? And that's going to give you a better sense of at what stage in this development life cycle should I be engaging with them more? And what does that look like? How do I show value in my engagement with them? And so again, I think research should be involved throughout the life cycle. Insights should be taken into consideration and be used to shape the product strategy as well as the actual execution of the product. But I tend to find myself working more with the product managers early on in the product development life cycle, really just to think about what are we trying to accomplish, right? What is the goal that we're trying to get to? And then when we're in the concept stage or the ideation stage, working more closely with the design partners and thinking about, what are all the different ways we can bring this to life, and then eventually with our data science partners to think about, for this A/B test, like what are we really trying to accomplish? How do we make sure we're meeting our goals? And so thinking about who you're working with and how to create that relationship and what their goals are is probably going to help you make sure that your insights are actioned on at each stage in that life cycle.
Yeah, very much agree that it's got to be throughout the life cycle. One thing that I've noticed that you can kind of be very proactive in and kind of like have a point of view and a stance on this is that all of our organizations work in sort of quarterly rhythms, and there's these seasons within a quarter that you can sort of plan for and be very proactive with. As a general rule of thumb, I've seen that early in the quarter, there's a lot of evaluative work, working with designers, so you know that's coming, you can get ahead of that, you can plan that, you can look at the projects that are coming down the pipeline, and even if no one's, you can plan those in yourself. Late in the quarter, you're probably going to be doing evaluation with ethnographies as things are launching. In the middle of the quarter, there might be a little bit of a lull. That's an opportunity to do generative research. So kind of like proactively plan those things in instead of just waiting for the work to come to you. So it's not just research as a service, but as an organization, you have a stance, a point of view. You know the type of work you want to be doing, and you're doing it. Because a lot of it is very repetitive, quarter to quarter, as you see those seasons within the quarter change.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. So I think what I'm curious about now is, Peter brings up a great point earlier of from the perspective of a researcher, to up-level your skill and to have an influence in an organization, you need to be able to understand the business objectives, right? You need to understand what is the business trying to drive, what are the different stakeholders that you're working with trying to drive, what do they care about? Really curious from all of your experience working with design teams and product teams, what are the skills that you believe that product managers or designers or cross-functional peers should have in terms of how they interpret, analyze, and work with data?
I can go.
This is a hard one, usually.
I actually think curiosity, like that's a really, really big one. I think just having the ability to say, you know, maybe we don't have an answer or we don't know what that answer is, but I'm curious enough to ask the questions that need to be asked so that I can get to an answer. I think that is probably the most important skill. And then I think also, again, going back to the relationships, right? It's thinking about what each person and each stakeholder's goals are and how can you create a really strong set of hypotheses ahead of time that you are either going to validate or invalidate rather than going into it thinking, you know, we'll find what we find. And that's, trust me, that never works out. And so I think for me personally, what I try to do is like really sit down and have each stakeholder articulate what their goals are and what they're trying to accomplish, and then generate that list of hypotheses that we want to test together so that we can then work through checking them off, you know, one by one.
Yeah, I think curiosity is a fantastic answer. I'll also add, at least for designers and product managers, sort of a willingness to adapt and an openness to feedback, right? Because I think it was mentioned before, we've all had this instance where something makes sense, and then you actually look at the outcome of the user research or the data, and it actually is pointing the exact opposite direction. A willingness to accept that and change your thinking rather than ignore it and find some other piece of data that correlates with what your bias is, just to kind of like really be humble and realize, you know, we don't know everything. Or even if the story makes sense in your head, that doesn't mean that's what's actually happening.
I'll have a crack at this. I think that most of the time when there's a lot of work involved in something, there is a business initiative with a clear business goal. And I feel like it's everybody's job to make sure that everybody understands fairly deeply what the business initiative is and what the business goal is, because then you can get feedback on what are we really doing here. And I feel like from the product seat, it's product's job to articulate that if that's where the initiative came from, or if something shows up in any role, I feel like it's important to ask if the information isn't offered.
Yeah, I will add to that, but I love that point around, you know, recognizing that there are always sort of higher level strategic initiatives, right? They're business metrics, and the reason they exist is to sort of help align everyone in terms of what they're doing and why they're doing it. So I think being able to have those conversations at the outset around, you know, how is all of the work that we're doing aligning to these higher strategic initiatives, that also helps with fostering, in my experience, those collaborations, right? So that people are understanding, you know, why is it that they are working on a particular thing together.
Yeah, that makes sense. If we bridge the whole aligning our practice or the research practice to actually driving business objectives, I'm really curious what all of your experience has been like trying to measure the impact of your insights. I think that's usually a really popular question because so often, especially when you work with qual data, it can be very difficult to attribute whether your work actually drove a particular impact, right? If the product is successful or if it's not successful, how did your work, how did your discovery actually influence the success or the failure of something? So really curious, what are tips or experiences that you've had on measuring the impact of your insights?
I'm happy to jump in on this one. So experimentation is a huge part of what we do. Both my team, but also it's kind of like the bread and butter of behavioral science. And so the idea there, I'm sure many of us are familiar with, right? It's the ability to sort of, you know, isolate particular variables to understand, you know, what's the sort of unique and independent impact that, say, if you are introducing a design tweak or a, you know, content change, right? What impact does that particular instance or change have on a behavior? And so it's a way of, you know, being able to measure effectiveness and impact in that way. But I will kind of add that the impact of an experiment is not just in the experiment itself, right? There is a whole slew of insights and, you know, ideation that has lended to ultimately whatever it is the design or feature that you're testing. And so being sure to maintain that link, right? So to give you a more concrete example, we may do a behavioral audit. So say we are trying to understand how are people going through a digital experience, and maybe we identify their drop-off points. So the goal of that behavioral audit would be to really contextualize that behavior, right? To understand, not just through looking at the behavioral analytics of where the drop-off happened, but when you combine that with, say, voice of customer research, with call center calls, right? You're trying to understand why did people drop off. It's really getting at the why. And so from there, that could give you confidence around maybe what the solution in that moment might be. Maybe people are dropping off, they don't have enough information. So as you're working with the design team, you'll think about maybe some type of intervention or solution rooted in providing education or context. So that's just an example. But ultimately, when you get to the point where you're now testing this, say at scale, in an experiment, and say it is effective, don't forget that that started with that behavioral audit, right? And those insights feeding into the design choices. That's kind of how I would also think about it.
Yeah, I will say, so Christelle's one of my favorite person in the industry. I think one talk that Christelle did in 2021, right, or 2022 in New York was on behavioral science interventions for research. And she did a similar talk earlier this year at a learners conference, which I'm happy to send that to everyone because it does reflect what she said with specific tips on how you can incorporate that into your practice. It's not, a lot of it is also changing the mindset of how you run research studies. So from the beginning, when you do run it, you think of it as if it's a intervention.
And you're too kind.
Does anyone else want to add anything to that answer for measuring impact, or Auzita?
Yeah, I think of it in two major buckets. The first one is just the business metrics, right? And that's something that you are collaborating with your product managers, your designers, and really thinking about, can I very clearly articulate exactly the problem that we need to solve? And then can I work with them to make sure that we are, ideating and testing variations of solutions, and then working with data science to test them and make sure that they're, actually effective. And then the second category is user sentiment, right? I think as researchers, like a big part of what we do is make sure that people are having a good experience on the platform. We use things like CSAT to measure, satisfaction. And I think using a combination of those two things, one in which you are very clearly focusing on how do I collaborate with all of my other stakeholders and functions to make sure that we're making progress on things, but the other is making sure that we have a really good handle on understanding the space, the problem, and the things that we should be working towards so that we can then work towards the business metrics.
I think,
thought.
oh, go ahead.
Okay, mine is quick. I thought of something, which is that you can sometimes set up when you're going to roll something out. Sometimes you can set up the rollout and, in order to particularly capture data about impact later. Sometimes it's hard to get that data, or sometimes the data just doesn't exist if you don't set things up in order to capture it. So, so that's something that's helpful to think of up front.
I think one thing that comes to mind for me as well is obviously experimentation and tying it to insights is a very granular and very effective way to measure success. But what I've also tried to do with my teams in the past is, where you're often spread very thin, we often have to make choices or help influence where we get deployed, is looking at these higher level OKRs and seeing if we can deploy ourselves to that. And then it's always sort of one of these, obviously it's a team win, but one of these very satisfying moments if one of the experiments that you've run is so successful that it's actually be able to influence these higher level OKRs and the attainment of them. And then it's one of those very satisfying, cascades into a lot of other happy things as well, moments when it's you can rally with the team and say that OKR was attained because of that experiment, which came out of our insight. And so making sure that you aim to the right goals and aim high, because it can be very influential.
Yeah, that's a really good answer, Yoni, and it reminds me of a discussion that I had recently actually with a product leader from Intuit. So this product leader brought up that I think we're quite good at prioritizing tasks. So the whole job of not the whole job, I would say part of the job of a PM is to help prioritize what to do, right? We need to make sure that we understand what we're doing right now is what would drive the most impact. But this product leader also brought up another interesting point. What they haven't quite figured out yet, and what I know a lot of people haven't quite figured out yet actually, because I often get this question is, sure, we can prioritize tasks, but how do we prioritize insights? If my research team or my data science team were to give, like 10 new insights to me, how do I know which insights to tackle and actually turn into product strategies? So what's your experience with helping others determine that these are the insights that need to be prioritized? Or thinking from your experience working with maybe perhaps some of the best product teams, how do they prioritize insights?
That's a hard one. I mean, it's interesting, right? I think I've definitely not been in the position where I think there's an overwhelming tsunami of insights. I think what I've found myself in is where there's these insights and they're not always aligning well, right? And so obviously you're trying to find that kind of like, in some instances, that critical mass. But often to me, it seems more like, it feels a little bit like, being especially as a product leader, like you get a lot of data thrown our way, like you're a detective, right? You're following the clues and trying to see the whole picture come together. But yeah, it is common for things to contradict each other, depending on where the data is coming from. There's a little bit of bias thrown in, and so I don't think there's a perfect way, and that's why our product strategies are still done by humans and not AI yet. But we'll see how long that lasts.
I'll give a partial answer to the question. I was with a modeling group, so we were generating insights, and I think one way to prioritize this is to think backwards and think, well, if I knew the answer to this question, what would the impact be? And so if it would be high impact, then that goes up the stack. And you can think about it both ways. If the answer is yes, does it make a difference? If the answer is no, does that make a difference? Is it important to know yes or no, or both? And that's also helpful.
I love you sharing that framework, particularly the point around the impact and kind of leveraging impact to help with prioritization. And then to the point around maybe, if we've learned anything from working with any product folks, that's one thing in my experience that I've been really thankful of, which is having been able to work cross-functionally with some very strong product leaders. And actually, in the context of working with them, one thing that I learned, borrowed, and now apply are that there are these great frameworks that you can use for prioritization. So in particular, and this is the one that kind of, with the neuron fire that has impact, the RICE model is one that I personally use with my team. So it's, once you have your insights or your projects or initiatives, right, thinking about them in terms of their reach. So, the R in RICE is here, like the reach in terms of the number of people or stakeholders that this insight could be influencing, right? And then there's the I, which is the impact, which is now thinking about, the impact that this particular insight could have. Then there's C, which is like your confidence now in either like data that you have to support this. And then E, which has to be factored in, is effort, right? Because we don't have unlimited budgets and so forth. So thinking about it in terms of the degree of personnel that will be involved, or the costs, right, or the time. And so kind of even just implementing something like that can help already with prioritizing more of your insights. And some of these will have like metrics, or they'll have specifically like equations that you can use if you really want to like quantify this prioritization process. So that's just something that I've been grateful to learn from product.
I'll just add 3 things in addition to what they talked about in terms of impact. So impact is obviously very important, and I think you did a great job of talking about what constitutes and how do you think about impact. There's a couple other things that I have seen be effective in the past. One of them is severity. How severe is this issue? Is someone going to be in danger or have like a really bad terrible experience with this product or experience if we were to launch it? And that's one other thing that you should consider. So severity and then also urgency. So this has been a thing in the past where something is new to market, and if your competitors are doing it and you don't get there fast enough, that is going to be a problem. And so how do you factor that in when making decisions about whether or not you should go after something? And then timeline. And sometimes it's all about just, well, if it's going to be a really short amount of time to fix this thing that is going to give us X amount of impact, maybe it is worthwhile to do it and check that box off. And so I would say just think about those three things in addition to generally about impact.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. I think that transitions really well to actually we have about 12 minutes left. So I'd love to start asking some of the audience questions that they submitted actually prior to this event. And then I'll open the floor up to any questions that you all might have. Someone will just Kevin will hand the mic to you if you have questions. I think we'll take 2 or 3. And for those online, please submit your questions if you haven't already on the chat, and Lillian will actually send it to me. All right, so the first question is actually, this is a pretty hard one. So related to what we just discussed, imagine that you run into the CEO just before you reach your morning coffee. Yikes. They ask, how does your work contribute to overall company revenue? Bonus points if you can answer realistically as if you haven't had your coffee yet. And this is from Mark from Toronto. Who wants to take this one? Mark, your question stumping everyone. So how would you discuss or have that discussion that research does drive revenue?
I think the way that I would start that conversation is actually talking about an example of a time where research did have a really big impact. And so I would just go back to, the launch that we were supposed to have in India 2 months ago and we didn't. Well, that's because our research showed us that it was a really bad idea and we weren't prepared to do that just yet. And so making sure that we are guiding our business strategy and making sure that we have, the right outcomes and the kind of business goals that we want to accomplish, we need to really understand the value that we're bringing to our users. We need to understand their sentiment towards our products and our experiences, and that's what I help us get as part of my role, as a researcher.
I'll throw this back to Mark and say I think it's important to have that answer in your hip pocket, because you're going to get that question either in the back of people's minds, or you might run into people in the elevator, and it's handy to know, when people say, why are you doing the job you're doing? It's good to have that little elevator pitch.
I had a little PTSD because I had one of my previous CEOs ask me that question. Not about me, but about specifically my research team. This was 2023. My answer was just very pragmatic, and so this may not be the cleanest answer. And so my validation for the user research team specifically was, well, one, I said it was the highest ROI function we have. And especially this organization was very engineering driven, very engineering focused, very large, 800 engineers. As I told them, as a measure of getting our engineers to run more effectively, it is huge, right? Like a lot of that organization ran by having designers design something, having engineers build something, put it out there, realizing it's not working, and starting that cycle over again. And what I saw is that the bare bones, simple, evaluative research saves half of those cycles at least, right? And so from that point of view, the research team that I had deployed was incredibly valuable, and we saw it in a lot of other metrics as well. And then the other, which I think is a more fluffy answer that this CEO don't think hit quite as hard, but I do think is very real, is helping us figure out where to deploy ourselves. We're always building product. Everyone is very capable at building product. Product managers, we love to build things. We're very rarely building the right things, right? And so making sure that you're actually building the right things that impact the business is incredibly important. There's not a lot of support organizations that help us do that, help us validate that. And so stubbornly, he did believe that we always knew what we were doing, but the engineering efficiency, which I think is just kind of like the ground level of user research, struck a chord. And,
And as a follow-up to you, Yoni, how did you measure or track ROI of the research team, actually?
How we measured? Oh, well, for us, it was just generally because this was a GM model, so there's all these different groups and all these kind of like different small companies, and so our output in terms of OKR attainment was just generally very high. We're a very small engineering organization. There was a little bit of like apples to oranges, so it wasn't always perfect because like you've got engineers globally deployed, and we had a US team. But generally, we were much more effective at completing what we were setting out to do. And whenever leaders would try to analyze our engineering organization, like why is that? Why is this team so good? They realized that the answer was outside of the engineering team itself, and the engineers themselves would point to that. Of like, we're good because we don't build stuff that doesn't work because of our research team. And engineers love to build things that work. They hate to build things that get rolled back or don't work. And so make sure that you work closely with them and that they realize that you're their biggest ally.
That makes sense. Does anyone else want to add anything?
There we go. I love that point. I also love the point around always having your response in the back pocket. But to Mark, what I really like about the question is that, what it highlights is that we always, and it's our responsibility to always be aware of what the business strategy and objectives are, right? Because regardless of what your response is, it should be reflecting how your work is connected to that, right? So you should feel confident in knowing, there's a, focus on, say, revenue or growth, right? And being able to at least align how the work that you're doing sort of maps onto that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's something that you probably have to be consistent about, right, Christelle? I noticed that a lot of teams actually try to do it whenever the fiscal year is about to end and budget conversations are starting to start and you're working on your P&L for next year. You're not going to sleep for a few days if that happens. Measuring impact and tracking the impact of your work is something that you have to consistently do. You have to treat it as if it's an actual metric, and just it's at the end of the day, it's a lot for managers, but it is very empowering for your team, and it saves for a lot of time at the end. Cool. Let's move on to a couple of questions about up-leveling skills. So a number of designers, researchers, and product managers actually ask about how they can up-level their skills. So I'll start with the question from Jasleen English from Toronto also. Lots of people from Toronto asking questions today. What technical skills should a researcher develop for moving from mid-career up to more senior levels? Perhaps this is for Christelle and Auzita.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I think it's less about particular skills and more about the way that you think about your impact, your collaboration, your narrative, your storytelling. I think it's more about how you move from answering more of the very obvious or specific tactical questions to being able to think more strategically. How do you collect sort of all of the information that you're getting from 4 or 5 different tactical studies, and then use that to create a more strategic narrative around what the business should be thinking about and what we should be going after. And so I think to me that's more of the difference, I would say, between a more mid-level or a senior researcher is that ability to go beyond the specific question that's being asked of you, and really think about, well, I am an expert in the space. I have, domain knowledge. I have an understanding of what we should be doing in order to create a better experience. How do I leverage all of that to ask the right questions, get the right people involved, and get us working on the right things, right? So I think to me, that's really what I would focus on, is how do you collect, the support and create the ability for yourself to work on larger, more complex problems, and then think more strategically about where the business should be going.
Yeah, I love that and definitely agree with that in terms of, it's definitely moving beyond just being, experts at the methods that we're doing or how we apply them, right? It's starting to think much more, to your point, strategically now, and even to the point of guiding people into thinking about, how we're establishing our strategy.
Yeah. I think some knowledge of finance also and business metrics is really important for that. So one advice that I always give to my research team in the past is pick up a finance book and and read a couple of the ways that businesses actually measure revenue, like what are the different financial ratios that you try to drive, and try to tie your insights to that. And so often researchers actually feel nervous about tying their insights to business metrics. But you know a team that does that really well, that don't necessarily have a finance background? Marketing. It's really hard to measure the impact of ads, right? Like sometimes it takes 2 years, 3 years. Sometimes you might not see the impact. You're not the last hit. The ads might not have an impact until later on, but it does. So marketing has really nailed down the ability to talk in terms of business metrics, and even though it's as much of an art as a science, they've really nailed the ability to talk in terms of business metrics, and I think researchers should feel confident as well.
You're actually also making me think about, as you're talking about
Yeah.
being able to confidently talk about business metrics, it's also making me realize there's a piece of it that is also about starting to change your communication and how you communicate. So, by that I mean actually being more proactive in establishing rapport with various stakeholders and with leadership so that they can get to know you, they can start to, understand the work that you do, but that's building trust as well and credibility. And in fact, I'm thinking at a certain point, I thought this was very interesting. I was on a team where, there were varying ranges of roles, some that were more IC, some that were more management roles, and we were doing sort of like a team building exercise where, someone came in, we did a couple of, like personality, questionnaires to start to learn about each other better. And one thing that we learned was that, one of the differences between some of the individuals who were maybe still earlier in their career versus those who were in management roles or who interface more with leadership was this dimension of reactivity versus proactivity. And so, the individuals who are kind of more in these, middle management, senior roles, they tend to exhibit more proactive tendencies compared to, those sort of earlier in their career who were more reactive. And so I think that's something else to consider, right? Really building that proactive muscle.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Well, I'll pass the question to Yoni now. A couple of designers also asked, because so Yoni used to be the head of design at Yelp, and a number of designers have asked, how can I be better partners to researchers, and how can I be more data driven, especially if I might not have a strong data background and I'm not comfortable working with data yet. Where do I start, and how can I start?
Yeah, I think it was answered before. Just start with a curiosity, right? Like, see, there's an overwhelming amount of data, especially I know folks who like to collect data. It's fun to collect it all, but for someone who has to use it, there's an overwhelming amount of it. And so look at it as your library for answers to questions, and just try to think of, for your next project, and I think this goes beyond just designers. For your next project that you're tackling, think of 5 questions you have to yourself, just about the behavior, about the product, about how your users are doing, that you're just curious about, that can help you better solve for that need. And then talk to your peers and go chase down those answers. And you'll automatically bump into some data store somewhere, some tool. Your peers will gladly help you solve that curiosity and help you on your way. But realize that nobody, or at least I don't, look at these dashboards and I just kind of squint and suddenly I see the insight. That's not how it works, right? It works with I have a question, are my users doing this? And you go find it. And so it just starts with that curiosity. List 5 questions, chase them down. And I promise those 5 questions will not have the answers you expect, and it'll probably lead to at least 5 more. And so then you're kind of on your way just becoming better at this, because you'll eventually start to figure out where things live. And it'll help you better solve for your users.
Cool, thanks, Yoni. So for you, Christine, actually, it reminds me of a conversation we had at a coffee shop a while back, maybe earlier this year. You mentioned that some of the best product managers you've worked with or had the pleasure of managing or collaborate with, all were very good at identifying signals that end up being important insights and drive impact. So someone, actually a PM, asked a question earlier this week, what are ways I could be better at identifying these signals, especially if I may not be too comfortable working with quant data yet?
I think that one element of pre-work is to make sure that your antenna is up to capture the signals. So, and there's more than one antenna, right? So there's put all the antennae up, and then you'll get used to seeing the signals, and that will help you get an intuition for what they mean. So I'll say that to be really good at this is related to practice, and by collecting signals and then seeing how they play out, you're automatically working that muscle and doing reps. And then when you see something new that it is impactful to your area, you'll be able to recognize that fact and then track it down to where it leads you.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. All right, so let's move on to a question from the online audience, actually. It's from Cian Her. Any tips and tricks you could share on how you share insights to get your point across, whether it's influencing product direction or getting buy-in or just helping your audience to better understand what you do? So I think it's more along the lines of how do you talk to different stakeholders and actually influence their thinking?
I can start. I really like using journey maps, actually. I think that that's a very effective way to triangulate a lot of different kinds of insights, and then have a very visual way of taking someone on that journey with you and really showcasing, at these different points in time, here's the emotions, here's the kind of opportunities we have, here's the pain points, here's the data, here's the survey result, here's the quote from someone in the Philippines. I think it just allows you to very naturally bring together a lot of different pieces of information and tell a story through it. Another thing that I've really liked doing and used in the past is allowing the user to speak to the team directly. And so addressing the team or writing a letter to the team or saying, watch me go through this task and see how miserably I fail at it, right? I think it just gives them a much better connection to the actual problem that the user is having or what we're really trying to solve for. And so I think generally my advice is think creatively about how you can just bring a tighter connection or a closeness to the people that are experiencing the issues that you're talking about or the insight that you want the team to have, stick in their head, and think about a really interesting, creative way you can do that. So the next time they have a conversation, they're like, well, Christine was really struggling to check out on the app for XYZ reason, right? So let's go fix that for Christine. I think that just makes it much more it just makes it easier for the team to connect to the insight and then also action on it. So that's what I would do.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Would you like to add anything, Christine? Or
I'm good.
you're good? Okay.
I guess the one thing that I'll add to that, and I love that answer as well. One thing that I'll add, and it may be kind of a weird answer, but hopefully it's a helpful one, is particularly when it comes to communicating, right, the value of your work or just your work in general to different stakeholders, is it can help to understand, their motivations, right, in terms of, their expectations, what they're looking for. And what I'm really getting at is even when thinking about, say, I'm sure many of us, are thinking about how to craft presentation decks or deliverables, right? And say you are even working in a visual domain. When we think about how vision works, it's definitely more top-down than it is bottom-up. Meaning, we think we see through our eyes, but it's actually there are, the expectations we have, the attitudes that we have, the motivations, they're actually going to influence where is it that we're looking and how we're orienting in space. The reason I bring that up is because it can help to really think about, okay, for this particular audience or the CEO, right, what do they care most about? And actually using that to be the anchor of what you start to focus on, right? So maybe that first, literally the first few words or the header on your deliverable are around that metric or around that strategic piece that they care most about, so that it draws their attention, they're more engaged, and then they can digest the rest of what you're saying.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Also, one small thing, or maybe not very pragmatic, is find more more venues to broadcast research. So find, whether it's an engineering show and tell, have there be an insight section. If there's a weekly status deck, make sure that there's an insight section. Don't just wait for the opportunities. we don't always get enough opportunities to share insights. So make sure that you're creating those opportunities. If there is no weekly status update, if there is no engineering show and tell, create a weekly, monthly engineering insights update that you invite people to. Like, kind of create venues to share as well, so people can hear about the Christine story, you know?
I think experiential is also really important. Actually, a friend of mine works in a team that is currently building a better maps. And they build it in Southeast Asia, and so they have a team in Europe and in Southeast Asia. And what they did was they brought all of the European engineers to Jakarta, and all of these engineers rode in motorbikes trying to figure out the roads in Jakarta. And I'm Indonesian, and I grew up there, and the roads in Jakarta is the most complicated thing ever. You cannot map anything there. You will often be lost. It's extremely hard to drive there. And so having people actually, bringing people once in a while to the field to actually feel what they're building for, to feel the pain point is also valuable at overall driving impact. Cool, all right, so let's take maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience here, if anyone has any questions. Yes? The microphone's over there.
Okay. I'm curious if you could elaborate more on how you measure impact. What I find, we also use RICE, but I'm finding because it doesn't take into account like more of a strategic long-term vision as well as customer voice, we're prioritizing a lot of things that take less effort versus like what's actually going to differentiate us in the market and add value to customers. And so I'm wondering, like, are we quantifying that impact wrong? And should it be more like longer periods of time, or how you integrate those other things like strategic vision, uniqueness in the market, and customer voice?
Love that question. And actually, to your point, in terms of how I've used RICE, it's involved adding in additional dimensions. So exactly what you're saying. And no, but it's a nice thing to know, though, that you can do that, right? So you can work off of a pre-existing framework like RICE, but then to your point, if you recognize that you want maybe more of that customer-centric lens, this is something we literally have done. We then think about adding that dimension, right? About, maybe the experience or satisfaction from that customer lens, because it is missing, to your point. Or if we want to add in, a particular like category that's related more specifically to a business strategy. And then it may sound like it's just adding more things, but it still helps with the prioritization because, and not to go into the details, but in case you're curious, ultimately how you can use RICE, it's an equation, right? So all of the factors, I believe with the exception of effort, you can multiply them and divide them by effort. So if you're adding in more dimensions, you can add those in as additional factors, and you'll still get a metric that you can then use for your prioritization. But I love your point, which is don't feel boxed in to a framework, right? You can expand it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. What's the longest you've expanded it to, Christelle? Is it like RICE?
7.
7, wow. Does the acronym still work?
Wait, that's a good question. What's the acronym?
Does anyone else want to add another answer to that?
I can add. One other thing that I consider is also risk, actually. Are we taking enough risk? I think the problem is usually that we're not taking any risk because, like you said, you want to have like that very quantifiable, end of year impact that you are able to tie back, to the developments that we've created. And I think that sometimes that actually holds us back. And so my personal goal is, am I doing just one long-term strategic project that is not on the roadmap, that doesn't have like a very specific ask and is not tied to a current, product team or initiative, but I believe is really important. And I think for me, like considering that risk factor and balancing out what I'm focused on is another way that I think about it.
All right. Would you like to add something, Christine?
Yeah, I'll just throw out, I think one approach to these really strategic goals, one problem with them is that they often don't have really hard metrics because they're in the future. But I think that our colleagues have talked about the power of storytelling. So I think that especially with these very futuristic things, if you tell a very compelling story, then your listener feels the impact, even though you can't necessarily equation it out and say, oh, it's got a 95.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Cool. Well, thank you. Let's give a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I learned so much from all of you, and it's always a pleasure. I'm very, very grateful that you took the time out of your day to help us learn more about building data-driven strategies. Cool. All right. So before we end today, I want to show you guys something that we've been working on actually at Riley, just very quickly. So I'll start by talking about the problem with data. And I know we talked a lot about solutions for data today, but so often we run into actually different problems. And I'll talk about problem with data from my own experience. So when I led a research team in the past, I often get stuck with something like this. It's like long pages and pages and pages of user research interviews, and some of them were stuff that I wrote, and I'm very terrible at writing notes. So they would often be extremely long, 50 pages of my own research notes, 30 pages of someone else's research notes, and end up being hundreds and hundreds of pages. And then we also look at customer app reviews, right? We go through app stores, there's like 60 pages of app reviews. Hopefully they're all 5 stars, sometimes they're 2. And then we get a list of all of these feature requests from our CSMs or our amazing partners in sales, and it's endless as well. You end up with like, one time actually my Google Sheets broke because it was so long, and I spent the entire day trying to figure out how to deal with Google Sheets. And let's not forget the bug reports. These ones scare me the most because I wake up at 4 a.m. to 5 customer complaints with never-ending bugs. Not at Riley, but at past companies. And so the problem I often face is, and I'm sure everyone here has faced, is you get all of these different sources of data, right? You get all of these interviews that you have to parse, all of the reviews, all of the bugs, the feature requests, and then you get endless videos that you have to watch on Gong or on any other providers. And you often wonder, with all of these data, how can I actually translate this into 1, insights, and 2, insights that I can prioritize? And I want to be able to actually make more of an impact in terms of delivering these insights to my stakeholders. How do I do it in a way where I'm not just like, my entire week is not just spent on wrangling data and trying to make sense of this data? How can I actually spend more time on using the insights to have an impact across the organization? So that's what we're doing with Riley. So as Kevin mentioned earlier, at Riley, we're building a product insights platform to help organizations decide what to build next. And we started the company about 5 months ago. Since then, we've been in closed beta. We're still in closed beta. And what we've been doing is working with some design partners across the US, Europe, and Asia on testing the AI that we've built to help cut down the data analysis process, automate all of the analysis of your disparate sources of data, and help you decide what to build next. So you can, as researchers, product managers, data scientists, focus on what's important, which is to look at the insights and add your perspective, add your subject matter expertise, and drive the influence to stakeholders. So what Riley allows you to do is select a business goal. So let's say you're working on an e-commerce checkout flow improvement. You're at an e-commerce company. You want to improve the checkout flow. And the goal is to drive adoption. You'd select the business goal when you create a project. And then you can add any customer videos from Zoom calls that you do. You can also add any notes, so any exports from Zendesk tickets, Gong exports, and combine all of those together, click create, and within minutes, we generate all of these insights for you. And these insights are trained on our AI that's actually trained on industry knowledge on what drives adoption, what drives retention. And so we help you skip the step of having to manually analyze all of your text analysis, and we just run into this model, help you determine from the recommendations who exactly or where exactly do these recommendations come from. So there are citations also. So you can actually discover if you're particularly curious about one recommendation, like let's say this one, improving the checkout process, how confident are you that your insights actually led to improving checkout process? We cite all of the insights from all of your data in one place. And what we've heard is very helpful for the research teams and the product teams that are early users of Riley is impact is important. So we built an easy way for you to actually drive impact with your insights. By just adding our Slack integration, you're able to choose the insights that you want to share and then share it on Slack and have meaningful discussions with any of your team members. So this is with one of my team members. You're able to have meaningful discussions, and what Riley does is we also capture the discussions that you have and remember it. We're launching some really cool features in the next few months of being able to essentially be the centralized place for all of your insights. So imagine a product marketing manager responding to a particular insight that you have about improving the checkout flow. Perhaps the product marketing manager says, I went to the CES conference recently and talked to 20 other customers, and they said these 15 other things that you didn't really capture on your research because their information, you can't always have that much coverage. Riley will remember that and alert you in the future to tell you, hey, so-and-so PMM said this in the past. These are important insights as well that you should remember that's tied to this other initiative and that will likely drive this particular metric. So think of it as your second brain that could help you continue to make better decisions with insights. So if you'd like to try Riley and be part of our closed beta, you can scan this QR code and join us, and I'd appreciate any feedback that you have. We have about a number of different customers using it and testing it right now. For those online, if there's no easy way to use the QR code, feel free to go to our website, askriley.io, and sign up there. And we're excited to test this. I've spent many years leading research teams, doing my own research, and I really, truly understand the pain point that we all experience, and we really want to build this for you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you to everyone who joined us online. And for those here, there's lots of cookies and pizza left. Please, please, please eat them, because otherwise I will eat them, and that is not good. Have a good night, everyone.